Believe it or not, writing a book is actually very, very hard. Writing a book that other people want to read is even harder. I never realized how hard it was until I did it myself. Because everyone thinks, fuck, I could do that. Go try it. So I haven't read it yet, but I know the comments I've heard, and from Colin and what he said. I just wanted to introduce everyone. And when you write a book, the amount of depth of research you have to do, especially in today's day and age where you get all the trolls to hate on you, the research is deep. So Craig Crouch is here to give you a great story on the Bonanza King.
Thanks very much. Well, thanks very much to Colin and everybody in Palisades Global for bringing me here to talk about my book, John Mackay and the Bonanza King, or The Bonanza King, about John Mackay and the Comstock lode. Now, I do not have a mining background. I did not know anything about mining 4.5 years ago when I started researching this project. I'm a writer, but I needed a story. My last book was a World War II flying story, which was a really fascinating project to be involved in. Took place in China in the 30s and 40s. Fascinating, loved meeting the old veterans. It had one crucial problem, is that every time I wanted to visit a location, it was on the wrong side of the Pacific in China, so I could only afford to go once. And I thought, well, when I needed a new story, it's like, there's gotta be something good closer to home. I live in the Bay Area in California. I was ferreting around in the early history of San Francisco, and I kept running into all these connections to the old Comstock lode. My mom had taken me up to Virginia City, which is, it's about 20 miles south of Reno and 20 miles east of Lake Tahoe. My mom had taken me up there when I was a little boy, and it's like this funky old Western town living on its Old West nostalgia up there, and I had this really nice memory of it. So I started looking into the story, and I went up there and visited, and the scale of what these guys did in the 1860s and 1870s is what really attracted me in the first place. Like, the tailings piles were massive, and these guys had dug it out of the ground by hand. As I started looking into the facts, the shafts ended up like 3,600 feet deep, and they were doing this with 1860s and 1870s technology. And my original question was like, wow, how the hell did they do that? And as I looked into it and got more and more interested, and I thought there was a book there, it seemed like the Comstock lode had been written about a lot, but it struck me that all the books kind of went down one of two channels, which was either dry and academic and maybe not that good on story, or they had fallen in love with the whiskey and the gun smoke and the hooker with the heart of gold legend, and that isn't true. And it struck me that there was like a nice wide channel right down the middle where you could actually tell the story of the Comstock lode when it was the most significant economic engine in the West in the 1860s and 70s. It was absolutely the Silicon Valley of the age. And so then I needed a main character. That search leads straight to John Mackay. He was the seminal figure in the history of the Comstock lode, rose from being a common miner working at the drift face in 1859. By the middle 1870s, he was one of the richest people in the world, and he for sure had the largest monthly cash flow from the dividends on his paying mines up there. Now, Mackay had a really humble beginning. He was born in Ireland in 1831. Very poor rural family, born in a single-roomed cottage, slept on a dirt floor with the family pig next to the manure pile, which was essentially the family's only property. They emigrated to New York in 1840 when he was 9. And things must have been going well. They settled in the Five Points neighborhood of New York. That's the Gangs of New York neighborhood, if you guys have ever seen that movie, when it was the most notorious slum in the world. Mackay the family must have been doing pretty well, because he actually went to school, and only about 50% of the school-aged Irish children in New York in 1840 received any schooling at all. That fell apart when his dad died 2 years later for reasons lost to history. Mackay had to quit school to support his mother and sister when he was 11 years old. He sold newspapers on the streets of New York, shined shoes, swept street crossings, carried packages for tips, all the sort of standard stuff an Irish street urchin. He caught on at a shipyard when he was 16 years old as an apprentice ship's carpenter. and learned carpentry, which was a skill that would serve him greatly in the West when he got out here. Gold gets discovered in California in 1848, 1849, you have the gold rush, and Mackay doesn't go. He was in the middle of his apprenticeship. He was always a man of his word. He always kept his word. And he had probably promised his services to his employer for the term of his apprenticeship. When that finished in 1851, he joined the gold rush, kind of at the tail end of the first blush of the gold rush. He went and mined around Downeyville, which is about 60 miles north of Sacramento in the Sierra foothills, mined there through the 1850s with no particular distinction. So, making enough money to support himself and remit some money home to his mother and sister, but never making a raise. And he said he would have stayed doing that forever, but for the problem of declining returns, right? They were good at what they did, these miners in those days. They worked really hard. They got the easy to find deposits out of the riverbeds, and returns declined from, guys were finding maybe an ounce of gold a day early in the gold rush to finding, that would have been say $16 to $18 worth of gold, to finding about $3 worth of gold per day by the end of the 1850s. And $3 a day wasn't enough to make grub, right? You were losing money at that rate. One of the many things I learned, which is obvious to everybody in the room, but not to me, was that you could work a whole season, find pounds of gold, and finish up much poorer than when you started, based on the cost at which it comes out of the ground. Well, anyway, Mackay and his partner were going broke in 1859 when the Comstock lode was discovered on the other side of the Sierras. That's a seminal moment in American mining history, the first hard rock mining discovery. Whole new style of mining opened up that Americans didn't know a thing about. Well, Mackay joined that sort of initial surge over the Sierras. He arrives on the Comstock lode June or July of 1859, literally without a nickel to his name, took a job working for $4 a day in somebody else's mine. And if Mackay had a competitive advantage, it was his legendary capacity for hard work. So he would work one full shift for $4, and then he would work another shift in exchange for feet. That is earning sweat equity in a mine. If you had a 400-foot mine, if you owned a 400-foot slice of the Comstock lode, that would have 400 feet in it, 400 shares that you could buy and sell like a stock. And there were huge aftermarkets or secondary markets in the feet exploded. And so Mackay is getting sweat equity for like driving an adit for some mine that doesn't have a cash flow, right? All these things, again, totally obvious to you, totally new to me, that if you have a mine, you have the potential for riches. You might not actually have riches, but you have the hope of riches. You have the hope of an ore body deeper in your mine. These guys had no way of exploring for it or drilling for it other than to dig a drift or an adit or a shaft to get access to the vein and find out whether there was metal in it. Sometimes there was, sometimes there wasn't. The price of the feet would rise and fall based on the expectations of future earnings from the feet. So Mackay, in the early days of the Comstock lode, there's a huge boom in silver stocks that's based out of San Francisco. So the San Francisco had this huge stock market erupt on Montgomery Street, which is still one of the big main business thoroughfares in downtown San Francisco, and the stock exchange was at 600 Montgomery Street. That is the site of the Transamerica Pyramid. So that's where the action was at in buying and selling silver shares or feet in the mines. Now, a young woman in San Francisco in 1863 would have not entertained a proposition from a gentleman who wasn't at least a centipede and hopefully a millipede, because so much wealth was held in the feet. And there are all kinds of great jokes in the newspapers like, well, there are many people that walked into Virginia City on 2 feet and now own thousands, and when there was a big bust in the market, they will be leaving on the same 2 feet that they walked in on. And so the mines get going. Mackay is recognized for his leadership capacity, and he becomes a gang boss and a shift leader and an underground foreman and a superintendent. And he's gradually working his way into ownership. And in the first Comstock boom, which is like 1860 to 1863, 1864, he owns a lot of interest in different mines, and then there's a big bust in 1864, and he consolidates all of his assets into one mine, one tiny sliver of the Comstock lode, a 94-foot mine. It's the thinnest little mine in any of the old mine maps. It's called the Kentuck Mine. If you guys have been to Virginia City and Gold Hill, that mine is literally out the back door of the Gold Hill Hotel. So it's right there in Gold Hill. And Mackay he's got a partner. They invest all of their money into the mine, but it's still not enough to get down. They need to dig about a 250 to 300-foot shaft. So they have to borrow money. Mackay borrows $20,000 from a guy named James Phelan. That's the Phelan building in San Francisco, which is right on Market Street. That's the family. And the terms of the loans in the 1860s, you guys think you have bad cash terms today. It was, you borrowed money for 3 months, that's the term of the loan, and the interest rate was 3% per month. And then the note is due, you have to make a balloon payment after 3 months, or your creditor can seize your asset. And since Mackay's only asset is the stock in this mine, he has pledged his mine to this loan. They spend most of their 20 grand over the course of the 3-month term of the loan, get down to about 250 feet, and don't find ore. Worse, the mine right next door, the Crown Point, hits an ore body about 40 feet deeper than they are. It seems likely that that ore body might spread into the Kentuck mine, and if it does, that mine is now worth a whole lot more than $20,000. So if his creditor has been paying attention to conditions on the Comstock lode, he'll call that loan, Mackay will default, the creditor will seize the stock in the mine and reap the benefit of the ore body that probably spreads into his mine. So it's the most vulnerable moment in Mackay's life when he goes into this negotiation desperately needing this loan extended. And he slams his fist down on the table and says, "Mr. Phelan, 3% interest per month is outrageous. I demand you reduce it." And Phelan slams his fist down on the table and says, "Young man, if you know what's good for you, you'll accept an extension on this loan and say nothing about the interest rate." And Mackay hems and haws and protests, but of course that's exactly what he wants. He eventually accepts the loan. And a few weeks later, they hit the ore body in their mine. It did prove to span the entire width of their mine. And over the next year and a half, he and his partner took $1.6 million worth of gold and silver out of that mine. That set Mackay on the road to riches. He gets married about that point, which we're going to back to in a second. Being a miner, his buddy wants to quit. They've made about a $600,000 raise out of this, which is real money in the 1860s. His partner doesn't think that this is worth it to stay in the West, so he wants out. They have to sell their mine. Mackay ends up with about 600 grand from this investment. He, being a miner, invested in other mines, 2 of which don't pay off, but the third mine, he has about 200 grand left. And at that time, most of the good Comstock mines, so Crown Point, the Yellow Jacket, the Alpha Imperial, the Hale and Norcross, has fallen into the hands of the bank ring. These are the evil San Francisco capitalists that have controlled the lode. Now their racket is that they will accept mine stock collateral as a bank and loan it at 2%. So everybody wants to get their money loaned to them by the Bank of California, but they insist on receiving the proxy vote for every share pledged as security. And since many people want to make further mining speculations with their already existing money, they insist on getting the proxy vote for the shares that are bought. And you could buy on margin in these stock exchanges. So they quickly acquire power in mine management. And when the Bank of California has a 51% share of the mine, they toss out the superintendent and put their own man in. Turns out there are lots of ways to make money from a mine which don't involve digging gold out of the ground. And the Bank of California is gradually putting these into effect. They had gotten control through the same trick of loaning money to mills and then seizing the collateral asset when the mills they would cut off their, so then they now own the management of the mine stops supplying the mill with ore. They don't get paid unless they reduce ore, so they default on their loan, and the Bank of California seizes the mills. And then William Sharon Darius Ogden Mills and William Ralston, the three Bank of California head dudes, they sold those mills to themselves at bank's cost, right? So now they privately own the mills and they manage the mines, but they don't own the stock in the mines. So they start having their superintendents dilute ore with waste, and they are able, and that totally changes the economics of the thing. So instead of having mines that should be making lots of money and paying big dividends to their stockholders, those mines are paying small dividends to their stockholders and large sums of money to the mills that are milling waste in addition to ore. They make themselves the three richest guys on the Pacific coast working that scam. The vulnerability is that they don't own the stocks. So Mackay, my guy, forms a secret partnership with two Irish saloon keepers turned stockbrokers in San Francisco, James Fair, James Flood. Fair and Mackay were miners up in Virginia City, and then Flood and O'Brien were the stockbrokers in San Francisco. They had been gold rushers who opened a saloon in San Francisco that happened to be near the stock exchange. They start hearing good stock tips over the saloon top. They start taking action on them and discover a latent instinct for stock market operations. So they're doing okay. Mackay backs them with money, and they launch a secret raid on one of the bank ring mines that Mackay and Fair think is not being developed properly. And so, you know, you can see in the newspapers lots of shares of the Hale and Norcross mine trading back and forth in 1868 and early 1869. Nobody really notices that Flood and O'Brien are buying a lot more shares than they're selling. The next time that mine election comes around, they own 50% of the 51% of the stock or more. They toss out the bank ring's corrupt management, install themselves, put the mine on a paying basis, and because they are stockholders, their interests are now aligned with the public's, right? So they became very popular guys on the Comstock lode because their mine actually paid the full dividends to the public. And they were significant stockholders. Like Rob was telling us earlier, he takes $1 salary from his mines. That's actually more money than Mackay ever paid himself from one of his mines. There's no record of him ever taking a salary from any company that he owned. And in any event, they have a moderate success with the Hale and Norcross mine. The bank ring has a gigantic success in the early 1870s in another mine on the Comstock, and so they're pushed down into third place. And if they can't get another success of their own, they're going to become irrelevant. They invest their winnings from the Hale and Norcross mine into two neglected stretches of the Comstock lode, the California mine and the Con, Virginia. And if you are ever day drinking in the Bucket of Blood saloon in Virginia City, your ass is sitting directly over what was once the richest place in the world. They invest all of their earnings in prospecting that mine at 1,100 feet under the ground. They nick the top of an ore body that is just barely profitable. But, you know, as any miner would tell you, you know, you follow the ore. So they follow this ore down and down, and the quality gets better and better. And they, you know, would shaft and winds down another 100 feet and drift and crosscut to prospect and block out the ore body. They get down 1,300, 1,400, 1,500 feet. On the 1,500 foot level, it's ore like nobody's ever seen in the West. And they did something that nobody'd ever done before in Comstock mining, which was throw open the mine to anybody's inspection. So all these journalists get to go down and look at the 1,500 foot level, and there's ore all over the place of the richest variety that anybody'd seen in the West. They ended up taking $110 million out of that ore body between 1874 and 1879. And now that's the money that they reported to the government, so there's likely more in that. And how much money is that? There's $110 million out of that mine. The Comstock lode in general returned about $300 million in the 1860s and 1870s. And, you know, money values, it's very difficult to establish relative wealth or equivalencies over time, right? The consumer price index breaks down at larger scales of time because the value of commodities changes so much. People in the 1900s spent about 50% of their income on food. Food was super expensive, and that's a big component of the consumer price index. You can look at equivalent labor values, like an uneducated Irish ditch digger in New York in 1850 earned about $1 a day. That guy today is probably making about 120 bucks a day in New York, so there's an 120x equivalent, but that's a labor value. You know, there is an emotional component to money too, as anybody that's married will be able to tell you. But how do you measure the emotional component of money? Well, you look at it by taking your sum and comparing it to the total national economy. That gives a very fair comparison. If you do that with these 300 million Comstock dollars in the 1860s and 70s, it's the equivalent of about 600 billion modern dollars. That is tech industry money in the modern sense. That's the kind of influence that the Comstock lode had on people's mentality at that time. Well, Mackay has this immense mining success. His goal had always been to be a rich and successful miner. He didn't really have that much ambition for what to do with the money. Didn't really know what to do with it. His wife, she knew exactly what to do with the money. She's a very interesting rags to riches story in her own right. She had been married. She'd also grown up in Downeyville in the mining camps. She was married a few days after her 16th birthday, has 2 daughters with this doctor, and they moved to Virginia City in the boom times because that's where the action is at. Well, the doctor, although he had some promise, develops a powerful thirst for the territorial destructive whiskey, and gets addicted to the only useful medicine in his medicine cabinet, opium, and loses all their money in mining speculations. He disappears to Austin in central Nevada in 1864 to try and rebuild his fortunes. So she's abandoned on the Comstock lode. She is working as a seamstress to support her. One of their daughters had died, so she's got a surviving daughter. And you know, that's the lowest paid woman's occupation at the time. Although seamstressing from a modern perspective is very technical, every woman, it was part of their standard domestic education, so every woman could do this, so the wages were very low. He comes back, the doctor comes back, he's even more dissipated and more in debt than when he left. And when she is out sewing for one of the town's fancy ladies, the other daughter falls down the stairs and breaks her pelvis. That is a common euphemism for being kicked down the stairs. The doctor leaves the Comstock lode in disgrace, turns up, you know, a year later in San Francisco, dies of tetanus. The medical stuff in this era is just downright macabre, right? Things we don't worry about today, tetanus, for example. Wow, you do not want to die of tetanus. Anyway, he does. She is now a widow on the Comstock lode. 2 years later, she marries Mackay. They meet, fall in love. And when he's a man on the way up, but when he is not the richest man in the world, and she hates the Comstock lode. Think about it. You know, it's this dirty, industrial, loud town full of drunkenness and prostitution and drugs and violence, and she hates it. So she moves to San Francisco, and Mackay would commute. It only took a day by the middle 1870s to get from Virginia City to San Francisco, but San Francisco really won't do it either. It's still kind of an adolescent frontier town. They take a European trip in the early 1870s, which was really common for wealthy Westerners, and Paris just will do. So Mackay buys for her 9 Rue de Tilsit. Now, if any of you have ever stood on the Arc de Triomphe, you have that circular road that's around it. That's the Rue de Tilsit. 9 Rue de Tilsit is currently the Belgian embassy. It fronts the Arc de Triomphe. It's quite literally the best address in Paris. Mackay puts $10 million in bonds on deposit for her there, and he starts commuting between the mines in Nevada and Paris, where she's set up with their 2 sons now. Because it only took 8 days to get from Nevada to New York and only another 14 to get to Europe. She starts lavishly entertaining in Paris. She has more money than many European countries. 50% of the states in the United States had a smaller budget than the Mackays did per month in the 1870s. They were getting fire hosed with money. She starts entertaining lavishly, becomes very much accepted by European aristocracy. The first woman American woman to be widely accepted in European society. Mackay buys for her a famous necklace, the Mackay necklace. This is a sapphire, 157 carat sapphire, the size of a pigeon's egg, and it's decorated with diamonds and some lesser sapphires. It's a marvelous piece of jewelry. It's actually quite famous in the history of jewelry. And Mackay is commuting to his mines. They dig out the big bonanza. It takes about 4 years to get that thing out of the ground. 42% of the coinage of the United States came out of that 1,000-foot stretch of Nevada in the 1870s. And then when it's out of the ground, Mackay switches and he starts spending about 9 months a year in Europe, and then he would come back for a 3-month inspection of his properties. And they're touring Europe and taking in, he loved the arts and music and theater. They're taking in all these incredible sights. You know, this guy had been born on a dirt floor in Ireland, and now he is rubbing shoulders with the finest European aristocracy. And in 1883, the US president asked the Mackays to be the special ambassadors of the United States at the coronation of the Russian Tsar. So Tsar Nicholas III has his coronation in 1883, which is the most barbarically splendid ceremony in Europe in the 19th century prior to Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee. And the Mackays are the special representatives of the United States. Think about this, that they were absolute peasants. Mackay for sure had the lowest birth of every person in the Kremlin for that ceremony, including the servants. And that wouldn't have bothered him in the least. He was a very quiet and respectful man, and nobody ever heard him say a bad word about any woman under any circumstances of any station. However, of the male members of the European aristocracy, John Mackay was profanely contemptuous. He thought they were parasites and bummers and ought to have gone to work like I did. They were the toast of Moscow. Every newspaper in the world knew this incredible story about how this rough Irish immigrant had gone to the United States and gone out west in the gold rush and gone to Nevada and made this incredible journey from common miner to richest person in the world. And you know, the Tsar and the Tsarina like singled them out at the ceremony and had conversations with them, questioning Mackay about conditions in California and the United States. And so it's just an absolutely remarkable story. You know, that to me was like, what a life arc. You know, that's an only in America story if there ever was one. And after that, Mackay gets involved. He gets involved in the transatlantic telegraph because he'd spent so much money sending telegraphs across the Atlantic, which is a brand new communications technology in the 1870s. And his wife, her social conquests are coming back through the transatlantic telegraph cable and filling American society newspaper columns. So you can make a case that Louise Mackay is the world's first social media celebrity, because what is the telegraph but the world's first digital communications technology? And she, so there's that, and Mackay ends up, but Jay Gould, who was at the time the most hated American businessman, had a monopoly on transatlantic telegraph traffic, and Mackay was one of the few peoples in the world who had the money to tackle that monopoly. So he did. He got into a partnership with James Gordon Bennett, who owned the New York Herald. They laid a rival transatlantic cable, and there's this epic corporate struggle between Mackay and Jay Gould in this rate war that Mackay ends up winning. And after that, it's literally impossible to find bad press about John Mackay in the 1880s and 1890s. He was much beloved in the United States for taking Gould down a peg, a big peg. And ironically, I think that's the reason why he's not that widely remembered today, is Mackay was much beloved. Now, the industrialists who were his financial peers, by the way, that you do know from that period, Leland Stanford, Collis Huntington, Rockefeller, Carnegie, Mellon, Fisk, Gould, those guys you remember, those guys had an immense PR problem in the 1890s. Those guys were hated, and rightly so. The labor practices of Carnegie in the steel industry, oh my God, how those guys were not lynched is amazing to me. But they know they have a PR problem, so late in life they found these eponymous philanthropic organizations that have spent the last 100 years rehabilitating their family names, and it worked. Those guys are remembered. John Mackay, who was every bit as rich as they were and every bit as philanthropic, but he and his wife gave almost all their money away anonymously because he didn't like that public attention, is largely forgotten. And it was such a thrill for me to like discover and uncover this ore of a neglected story and, you know, kind of try and bring it to the public attention. And I was just thrilled the whole way through. And then the added bonus is that I didn't know what a thriving modern mining world there is. I got asked by this weird organization that I'd never heard of called the SME to give a presentation in Reno. And I'm in the basement of like the circus, and I was expecting like 10 or 20 people to show up, and all of a sudden it's this huge ballroom that's packed with miners, and what an audience, and everybody was very enthusiastic about the book, and it's been a lot of fun for me to sort of uncover the modern mining world, and I got invited to take a mine tour out there in Nevada, and well, just super fun, and all these great things are happening, and this is part of that. I thought those talks today were very interesting. I learned a lot, and you know, I look at your charts of up and down, that's just like Comstock did in the 1860s and 70s. It is a very volatile industry. You gotta have guts to be in it, right? So hats off to you guys. And thanks very much, Colin, for bringing me out. And I will be happy to entertain any questions and sign any of the books that you guys might have from today. Sir?
Is that why there's a Russian consulate in San Francisco?
I don't think so. You know, they've got a Russian consulate because there's a lot of Russians in the Bay Area.
Is that because of this long history?
Yeah, you know, the Russians have been in California since before the Americans. Fort Ross used to be a Russian sealing outpost, so there's a pretty strong Russian presence in California, yeah. Sir?
Are you an investor in
I wish I was. No, I'm not. I'm just a guy. They invited me to come talk about this because they're interested in it too. Sir,
well,
Jeff.
As a graduate of Mackay School of
There you go. Oh, thanks. And of course, that is not John Mackay's bequest. The Mackay School of Mines was a donation by his son, Clarence, in 1908. And there's that wonderful statue by Gutzon Borglum, the guy that sculpted Mount Rushmore, right in front of the Mackay School of Mines of, you know, Mackay leaning on his pick, looking directly up towards Virginia City.
Can you tell us a little bit more about did you say bucket or what?
Well, that's one of the saloons. They have been in continuous operation since 1876. I've seen a newspaper article mentioning a Keynote dealer who was locally famous in the Bucket of Blood in 1876 for the way that he called out E11 every time that came up. So that stuff is really fun to me, finding like little nuggets of that world. I mean, trying to capture a sense of what life was like on the Comstock lode when it was the second biggest city in the West. You know, think about that. There's 800 people in Virginia City today. There were 25,000 there in 1876. That was the second biggest city in the West after San Francisco. There were like 7,000 to 9,000 people in Los Angeles at that time, about 3,000 in Denver, maybe 5,000 in Portland. When you came west as a tourist on the train, the three things you had to see were San Francisco, Yosemite, and Virginia City. Ma'am? Oh, I hope so. No, I don't. I would love for that to happen from your lips to God's ear. Sir?
He's one of the great entertainment lawyers.
Oh, good. Well, no, I have not sold the rights. My other book was optioned for a while, but nothing ever happened, so I still own the rights to that. And I thoroughly believe that it would make a fantastic bio story.
American Peaky Blinders.
Okay, I think we're ready for dinner.
Think you understand the junior mining sector and you think that the participants in the mining sector, junior mining sector, are good people and kind people, hit the bid.
How violent that term could be, it actually could be quite violent. It could be a rip your face off uranium rally.
And the world is always going to need raw materials. It's going to need copper and gold and nickel and so forth.
Totally destabilized. Hey, Troll, did you hear what's going on in Yemen?